Hello, and welcome to Lesson 10, in which we are going to continue Judaism. So for today's lecture, we're going to start with the meaning in suffering, then move on to the meaning in messianism. Within that section, we'll also go over some messianic ideas, and then we're going to move into the hollowing of life and the importance of ritual. Then we will come to the latter part of the lecture, in which we'll go over revelations and the nature of Yahweh, and then the chosen people and Israel. But the overall theme here is we want to kind of get an idea of the philosophy behind Judaism, and more specifically, how that philosophy affected the people. Because Houston Smith states bluntly that what allowed the Jews to remain prevalent is the fact that they had this unquenchable thirst for discovering meaning in every aspect of their history, every action that was taken. And they were very creative in their ability to find that meaning even when the chips were down. Or possibly more importantly, they were able to find meaning even in their defeat. Which leads us to the first topic in this lecture, meaning in suffering. So Houston Smith starts off this section by kind of painting a picture of what Israel had to deal with during the 8th and 6th century, with powerful nations and aggressive powers like Syria, Assyria, Egypt, and Babylon bordering Israel and Judah. And the point here is that he's trying to show that Judah and Israel were a small nation surrounded by much more powerful opponents who were aggressive. So it was like any time now they were going to be conquered, or they could be conquered. But instead of the Jews seeing this as throwing their hands up and giving up, because by all social reasoning, all social laws or natural law theory, they would have been taken over and would have been erased from history. But it was the meaning that they found in this circumstance that set them apart. The prophets found meaning in their predicament by seeing it as God's way of underscoring the demand for righteousness. Houston Smith equates this to a parent and a child relationship, that after so many verbal exchanges, the parent is left with no other choice than to provide actions to teach their child. And in the case of the Jews, God sent opposition. Thus says the Lord, for the transgressions of Israel, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they sell the righteous for silver, and the needy for a pair of sandals. Therefore an adversary shall surround the land, and strip you of your defense, and your strongholds shall be plundered. Amos 2:6 and 3:11. So for the Jews, they believed that because they had forsaken righteousness, it was God's decision to make the city a curse for all the nations of the earth. Jeremiah 26:6. And stepping back a little, you can see how when you're surrounded by such powerful adversaries, it would be really easy just to give up and say, well, the powerful is what shall inherit the earth. We are weak. It's not going to work out. Survival of the fittest. I mean, they cannot control their adversaries. They cannot control what their adversaries plan to do. It would be really easy just to say, it's outside of my control. We're going to lose. But that's what separated the Jews from so many others. They saw this as punishment for not being righteous. And as we learned in the last lecture, this is where the writing prophets came in and said, we need to create a doctrine that holds righteousness above all, or a righteousness that all nations can adhere to. But in the case of suffering, they saw this as punishment for not being righteous. And in 721 BCE, Assyria came down like a wolf from the fold and wiped out the northern kingdom from the map. In 586, Judah, the southern kingdom, was conquered. But even in their darkest hour, the prophets dug deep to uncover an entirely new vein of meaning. Not to do so would have ended the biblical faith, according to Houston Smith, and the Jewish people along with it. But see, the book of Isaiah would argue that history was Yahweh's providence. Therefore, there must have been a point to the Israelites' defeat. Now, philosophically, you can try to think of what this would do. You've been defeated. You were a weaker nation, so it was inevitable. And yet, you don't see that as the reason. You dig deep to find meaning in this God that you believe so wholeheartedly in. And this meaning empowers you. And it empowers you in a certain way. It's almost as if they refused to make excuses. Their focus was that which they can control, or that which makes them stronger. As Houston Smith states, the Israelites needed to learn something that their defeat would teach. But their experience would also be redemptive for the world. The defeat taught the true worth of freedom, the yoke of captivity, how fervently they longed for their homeland. So then the prophet saw another lesson that only suffering can fully impart. The lesson that those who remain faithful in adversity will be vindicated. In the end, their rights will be restored because God is good. He is righteous. There is a reason for this suffering. They weren't righteous before and they're being punished for it. So if they remain faithful in their defeat, they will come out the other end vindicated. This is what they learned in exile. That through suffering, a passion for freedom and justice would come to affect all humankind. Which leads us to the deepest meaning that they found in exile. Meaning in vicarious suffering. That meaning enters lives that are willing to endure pain that others might be spared. What this means is the ability to take on suffering that would have been imparted to other people. You notice this twist in philosophy, this meaning that they were able to tap into that provides an unlimited source of perseverance. Isaiah related this general principle so that nations of the earth would see that the tiny nation they once scorned had actually been suffering on their behalf. They endured the suffering so that others wouldn't suffer. Suffering became a form of altruism. It became a form of benevolence. Suffering became meaningful because now they were suffering so others didn't have to. Meaning in Messianism. To quote Houston Smith, though the Jews were able to find their suffering meaningful, meaning for them did not end there. It climaxed in Messianism. Now, Houston Smith starts the explanation of Messianism by focusing on one key attribute, the way of progress, or the idea of progress. It's the belief that conditions of life can improve. Now, among the social classes, it's very easy to see how the lowest of the social classes would be looking towards progress or improvement. This is in contrast to South Asia and East Asia, where the presiding outlooks were forged by people who were in power. For India, it was the Brahmins, and for China, it was the literati. But in the West, their outlook was decisively shaped by the Jews, who for most of their formative periods were underdogs. And the philosophy behind this is ruling classes would be satisfied with the status quo, but the underdogs are not. Of course, unless their spirits have been crushed, as Houston Smith states, a characteristic that has not been associated with the Jews thus far. So the idea here is that oppressed people hope for improvement. And this hope gave the biblical Jews a forward and upward-looking cast of mind. So taking one step at a time, we had this idea of suffering and vicarious suffering, and that there must be meaning in suffering. And then in addition to that suffering, there is this idea that things will get better. And so since things will eventually get better, the Jews, being the socially weaker class, always have this idea of progress in their mind, upward movement, upward mentality. And like so many things, this hope and upward mentality would eventually become personified, or as Houston Smith states, rendered concrete. So eventually Jewish hope would come to be personified in a figure, the coming of a Messiah. Literally, Messiah from Hebrew means anointed. But as, kings and high priests were anointed with oil, the term eventually became a title of honor, signifying somebody who had been elevated or chosen. So now enters the personification of the Messiah. To quickly sum up, underdogs have only one direction to look, and it was the upward tilt of the Jewish imagination that eventually led the West to conclude that the conditions of life as a whole might improve. This came from that aspect of suffering, and that meaning can be found in suffering, and that through suffering you will eventually come out the other side vindicated. And so through this vindication and through this upward direction of look, hope is created. And this hope that's created would eventually become personified or made concrete into the idea of a Messiah, which leads us into the next section, the Messianic idea. So as to not confuse anybody, we are still in the meaning in Messianism, but this section starts talking about the Messianic idea, which I felt had enough information to require its own slide. And we will begin this section with hope. Now, hope, as Houston Smith states, had two sides. It had a political or national side and a spiritual or universal side. Now, the political or national side would foresee the triumph of the Jews over their enemies and their elevation to a position of importance in the world. So that's the political hope. The spiritual hope is that this political triumph would be attended by a moral advance of worldwide proportions, which means the world would become enlightened by this triumph. So with that in mind, we can move to the three features of the Messianic idea: hope, national resolution, and the world upgrade. Now, to reiterate, hope was for an age in which there would be political freedom, moral perfection, and earthly bliss for the people of Israel in their own land. What is meant by the national restitution is that there would be a renewal of the Jewish people to help return them to Palestine and found the state of Israel in 1948. And then now the world upgrade. Come to prepare the world for the Almighty's kingdom. Basically, some expected an actual Messiah to appear, and some thought that God would dispense with the human agent to intervene directly. Now, there is an interesting aspect to this messianism that Houston Smith calls restorative messianism, and it's something like the Confucian ritual and traditions, in which the focus is to go back to the golden ages, life lived with the ancestors, literally a recreation of past conditions. While that was the hope, as the power of the Jews dwindled in the face of rising Europe, and hope of political restoration in Israel seemed increasingly impossible, the expectation of a miraculous redemption strangled political yearnings. And this idea of apocalypticism replaced hope with military victory. But this apocalyptic type of mentality still had a utopian vision attached to it, in which after things were destroyed, peace would reign. So basically, in periods when the Israelites were still living an independent political life in their own land, ethical perfection and earthly bliss were emphasized. But in periods of subjugation and exile, the yearning for political freedom was more prominent. As Houston Smith sums up, in times of national freedom, the worldwide universalistic part of hope was basic. But in times of trouble and distress, the nationalistic element came to the fore. What eventually happened, though, is this political and spiritual longing would unite, and both of these themes would figure into Zionism. And Zionism is the modern movement for political and spiritual renewal of the Jewish people, which helped the Jews return to Palestine and found the state of Israel in 1948. Overall, the messianic idea is that there's this hope for a better future. It's this hope that the underdogs, through suffering, would eventually be renewed. And this hope would eventually become personified in a coming of the anointed. So now our focus shifts a little. We talked a lot about Jewish ideas and this concept of meaning out of suffering. And now we're going to look at Jewish practices. However, our focus is still going to be the philosophy behind these practices and how these practices come to mold the Jewish individual. And thus now we reach the hollowing of life. And by hollowing, they mean to make holy or to consecrate. And right out of the gate, Houston Smith declares that Judaism is less an orthodoxy than an orthopraxis. And what this means is that the Jews are united more by what they do than by what they think. And as Houston Smith states, one evidence for this is that Jews have never promulgated an official creed that must be accepted to belong to this faith. But observances, on the other hand, like that of circumcision, is decisive. So the emphasis is on practices. And this is what gives Judaism, according to Houston Smith, more of an Oriental flavor as opposed to the West, because the West was influenced more by Greek philosophy, where it's abstract reason is emphasized. Theology and creed was emphasized. But in the East, it's more of the approaches to religion through ritual and narrative become the importance. What they do through practice and ritual is more important than abstract reasoning and theoretical. That is what Houston Smith means by Judaism has more of an Oriental flavor. And from here, Houston Smith takes an interesting turn. He starts describing purely from a utilitarian understanding. Of course, utilitarian is that which promotes the most good, and thus a very pragmatic ethical association. If we were to look at ritual through utilitarian eye lens, it would be arbitrary. I mean, what they do is they spend a lot of money on lavish candles, cathedrals, prayer books. It's so arbitrary, it almost becomes incomprehensible. So why is ritual so important? Obviously, we'd have to look at it through a non-utility or non-utilitarian perspective. We'll look at it through an aspect of maybe through a social practical or social pragmatic lens. So what makes ritual important is that it plays a part in life that nothing else can fill. It eases us through tense situations at times of anxiety. It provides us a blueprint on what to say, what to do, how to proceed. It covers my uncertainty and awkwardness by bringing form out of chaos. One of the glaring examples Houston Smith uses is death. We are stunned by the tragedy. We are in this type of bereavement that we would flounder completely if we were on our own. So a funeral or a memorial service, a wake, a shiva, it gives us a blueprint on what to say, how to act. It allows us to work together and work through our grief. As Houston Smith states, it channels our actions and feelings at a time when solitude would be unbearable. So it's almost like ritual has this way of bringing us together when we need it the most, when we are at our lowest form of despair, suffering. Ritual has a way of bringing form out of the chaos. And this could be the chaos of our own feelings. A wake, a shiva, has a way of allowing us to work through these processes together. One can also see how having this ritual where we have to come together gives us courage. The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Ritual has a way of giving us the courage to deal with that heavy loss. When introduced to the trauma of death, ritual smooths life's transitions as perhaps nothing else can. Ritual also plays another interesting role that's less pessimistic and more optimistic. It can intensify an experience and raise joy to the part of celebration. Think about a wedding. Think about a baby's first birthday. These rituals where we celebrate together, and celebrating together intensifies the happiness, intensifies the experience, solidifies the importance, and most importantly, especially for our purposes, it can hallow the occasion. A marriage between two individuals becomes holy. A baby's first birthday becomes consecrated. And now with this understanding, we can turn to its place in Judaism, where Judaism basically aims to hallow life, ideally all life. In the same way that a ritual for Shiva consecrates a rite of passing and allows us to deal with death, and how a wedding is hallowed so that it becomes an event where God himself is present. The Jews look to establish hallowing in all aspects of their life. And this comes from this conviction that all life down to its smallest element can, if rightly approached, be seen as a reflection of an infinite source of holiness, which is God. And this right approach, this approach to incorporate this holiness in all aspects or all elements of life, is called piety. Now you may ask yourself, why inject holiness or God into every aspect? Well, the secret of piety consists in seeing the entire world as belonging to God and a reflection of God's glory. So then, piety prepares the way for the coming of God's kingdom on earth, the time when everything will be redeemed and sanctified, and the holiness of all God's creations will be transparently evident. So then why inject God into everything? Well, because God's eventually going to come back to this kingdom. So even the smallest things can mirror God's majesty. And we should enjoy life's goodness. And at the same time, we should augment this joy by sharing it with God, just as the joy we feel when we share with friends. So that hollowing that we discussed earlier, and how a first birthday party or a wedding is intensified the more we share it with other individuals, the way the Jews see it is, this is also intensified if we share the occasion with God. Perhaps it is intensified to its fullest by sharing all these small aspects with God. This has a way of elevating all these events to a platform of holiness. It also has a way, not really mentioned in the Houston Smith book, of promoting a certain kind of perfection. Because even down to a dinner or a meal with your family, you'll prepare the meal in the aspect of you're preparing it in the presence of the Lord. So you can imagine that you will do your best if you have this type of philosophy in mind. It has a way of teaching perfection. And then we can ask ourselves, how do we preserve this perfection? How do we preserve this sanctity against the backwash of the world's routine? And the Jews' chief answer is through tradition. Without attention, the human sense of wonder and the holy will stir occasionally. But to become a steady flame, it must be tended. So the Jews account the memory of the past as a priceless treasure. The Jews draw nourishment from events in which God's acts were clearly visible and find meaning that spans the centuries in affirming God's great goodness to God's people. So we can see how this is connected, this hollowing of life. We know the importance of ritual to make form out of chaos. We also know how ritual plays an important role in hollowing, as it provides a function and an elevation in times where if we were alone, we would go crazy or we wouldn't be able to endure it. Now take that aspect of this social function and this social ritual and include holiness or God himself. Now you've elevated all facets of life, even the small acts of life, into the majesty that is God. But now that God is here, you need to make sure you perfect these things. And in order to perfect it, one must tend to it. Now in comes tradition. But subtly, what you see here in Jewish philosophy is the existence of God here in small acts. And the basic manual for the hollowing of life is this law. The first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah. And for the Jews, the Torah is a creative power that can elicit and sustain holiness in the lives of those whose flowering world would otherwise become dry stones. It is a tree of life to those who grasp it. And with that, we'll move on to Revelation. So what enabled the Jews to produce the achievement of grasping meaning more profound than any other of their Mediterranean neighbors? Well, their answer to this is that they did not reach this insight on their own. It was revealed to them. This is where the term revelation comes from. And revelation means to disclose, as if a veil has been lifted and what was once obscure becomes clear. For the Jews, God revealed himself first and foremost through actions, not words, but deeds. And what was this act? It comes out clearly in Moses' instruction to his people. When your children ask you in time to come, what is the meaning of the testimonies and the statutes and the ordinances that the Lord our God has commanded you? Then you shall say to your son, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. Deuteronomy 6:21 to 22. This is the Exodus. This is that historical event in which God liberated an unorganized, enslaved people from the mightiest power of the age. This event was not only an event that launched the Israelites as a nation, but it was the first clear act by which Yahweh's character was made known to the Israelites. The fact that God was the direct party to their escape from the Pharaoh, the Jews never doubted. It seemed to them impossible that their liberation was of their own doing. It was a miracle. By the grace of God, Israel was saved from death and delivered from the power of the Egyptians. Exodus 12:50. Now you can try to imagine what this kind of belief would do to a people and what it says about Yahweh. From the beginning, God had been leading, protecting, and shaping his people for the decisive Exodus event that made of the Israelites a nation. So the Exodus was more than just a historical divide between the slaves and the Egyptians. It turned a people into a nation. And it was an episode in history in which this people became overwhelmingly aware of God's reality and character. God took the initiative. It was God who showed the Jews his nature. Now, before we get into the nature of Yahweh, think about what this does. This point in history, this Exodus, elevated a people. It gave them confidence that God is on their side, God had intervened, but also takes an interesting turn that we will talk about later on that combats this idea of favoritism. Because even though this Exodus event for the Jews was obviously of God's own creation, we have to keep in mind these are the same people that saw meaning in suffering, in that they had sold their righteousness and thus saw God in their decisive losses as well. And then, of course, through vicarious suffering. But this first initial historic act of the Exodus gives us a lot of insight into the nature of Yahweh. So what was the nature of the God that the Exodus disclosed? Well, first, Yahweh was powerful, able to outdo the mightiest power of the time, and whatever gods might be backing it. So the mightiest power being Egypt, and all these Egyptian gods, Yahweh was able to outdo them. But equally, Yahweh was a God of goodness and love. This God cared about the Israelites who were enslaved, and thus plucked them out of Egypt, unshackled their binds, and allowed them to become their own nation. Now, philosophically, from that goodness of that nature, it follows that God would want people to be good as well. Hence, we get Mount Sinai and the Ten Commandments. Since God was a God of goodness and righteousness, we shall thus reflect our behavior on goodness and righteousness. So the prophets demand for justice to extend God's requirement for virtue to the social sphere. That means incorporate this understanding of God and goodness and virtue into society. Thus the Ten Commandments. Also, suffering must carry significance, because it's unthinkable to think that a God who had miraculously saved his people would ever abandon them completely. So he's always there, even in the tiny aspects of suffering. And now we're getting to how Exodus links to that meaning in suffering. Because of that initial event, God wouldn't have done that for no reason. Thus, he would never abandon these people. He would never pluck them from Egypt and cast their shackles and then just abandon them. They believed God exists throughout history and in all of these small acts. because of the Exodus. They didn't feel like they deserved this miraculous release, not as far as they could see. Thus, this act was sheer unmerited grace and proof of Yahweh's astonishing love for them. Characteristically, this God is one that is concerned with human affairs and history. God had to come to them, not through the sun or through the storm or fertility, but in an historical event. An event that would have lasting impact upon the Jewish people. Because as Houston Smith states, the entire Gestalt, when it burst upon the Jews, took shape around the idea of a covenant. And a covenant is like a contract, but much more binding than your material contract. It involves the pledge of one's total self. And the Jews saw the Exodus event as an invitation to a covenant. Yahweh would continue to bless the Israelites if they would honor the laws they had been given. When God had reached out to Abraham, Abraham was entering into a covenant with God. So to sum up, this Exodus event allowed meaning to be secured from the Jewish perspective, not because they sought it exceptionally. It was revealed to them through Yahweh's actions, not words. But why was this disclosed to them? Well, for the Jews, it was because they were chosen. Now, these next two sections should be fairly quick, as we've already discussed really the philosophical meat of Judaism. Now, the Jews saw themselves as a chosen people, but Houston Smith wants to tread lightly here because he doesn't want the reader to come off as the Jews thought themselves as chauvinistic. It's not a creation story like, for example, that of the Japanese creation story where they are direct descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu. Moses tells the Jews that the Lord God had chosen you to be a people for his own possession out of all the people that are on the face of the earth. Deuteronomy 7:6. So they didn't see themselves as privileged. They didn't see themselves as being singled out. They were chosen to serve and to suffer the trials that service would exact. This means that in their existence, there's going to be much more suffering that goes along with this call to service, if you will. Houston Smith uses a rabbinic theory to kind of elucidate this, is that God initially offered the Torah to the world at large, but only the Jews were willing to accept its rigors. The Jews were elected to shoulder a suffering that would otherwise have been distributed more widely. So that's where that vicarious suffering comes from. They are willing to shoulder the suffering that would have been implemented worldwide. And they are able to do this because of their belief of and service to Yahweh. Now, even Houston Smith admits here that there is an idea of a special role and being singled out that looks like favoritism, and the Bible makes no attempt to avert this suspicion. It was not because you were more in number than other people, but because the Lord loves you, that he has chosen you to be a people for his own. Deuteronomy 7:6-8. But after being freed, almost immediately afterwards, they were brought to an understanding of God that was head and shoulders above that of their neighbors, and deduced from it standards of morality and justice that are still challenging the world. By every sociological law, the Jews should have perished long ago, being surrounded by so many powerful and aggressive adversaries. It's almost as if nature alone had taken its course, they would have been wiped from history. And even though they had this deep search for meaning, the Jews instinctively turned the credit Godward, persistently refusing to see anything innately special about themselves as people. But to sum up here, this idea of being chosen doesn't really come with a kind of chauvinism to the Jews. Them being chosen was chosen in service to God. So it is going to be difficult. There are going to be tough times ahead. But because of the Exodus and because they were chosen, they look for God in the small aspects of history. And even in their own destruction or demise, they're able to seek out that meaning and persevere. I mean, the northern kingdom was wiped off the face of the earth, and still the Jews persisted. They could have easily seen their small numbers as a sign that they are not supposed to remain ideologically independent, and yet they remained. They didn't assimilate. They kept their idea of God from this time of the Exodus and refused to concede a meaning that would make their God indifferent towards the people. And with that, we'll move on to Israel, or more importantly, the meaning in the biblical period and the meaning in the post-biblical period. Now, the first thing Houston Smith does in this section is that he highlights that everything we have spoken of took place in the biblical period. Now, he gives two reasons for this. The first reason is that it was in biblical times that most of the great formative ideas of Judaism took place. Reason two is those ideas constitute the side of Judaism that is more accessible to outsiders, for whom the book itself, World Religions, is primarily intended for. But he wants to give a warning here. Judaism cannot be reduced merely to its biblical period. In 70 CE, the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem that the Jews had rebuilt on returning from their Babylonian exile. And the focus of Judaism shifted from a sacrificial rite of the temple to the study of the Torah. So that's really where the prominent orthopraxis comes in. The fact that Judaism is so entrenched in learning the Torah, the fact that there are 613 commandments, Judaism is entrenched in lifelong study and ritual, not so much in hyperbole. And this came from post-biblical acts, just as much as biblical acts. Houston Smith points out that the rabbis, which literally mean teachers, they're the ones who held Judaism together. For it was the synagogues that became centers not only for study, but for the worship and congregational life in general. The Torah is a lifelong endeavor, and Judaism acquired a distinctively intellectual dimension. Study became prominent, including an unceasing questioning and the rigid sense of logic that pervades in the Talmud because of the way of worship. The Torah is followed by the Talmud, a vast compendium of history, law, folklore, and commentary that is the basis of post-biblical Judaism. So what Houston Smith is outlining here is the rigorous study that is involved in Judaism came a lot from post-biblical times. And with that, that's the end of Judaism. Make sure you focus on those reading guidelines because there's a lot to digest in these chapters, and the final exam will really come from what I highlight in the reading guidelines and, of course, the discussion board questions. Have a great week.